Welcome back to Draft Crush. I am your host, Ricky Rains. Usually I'm joined by my very kind, very well-spoken co-host, Edgar Salmingo Jr. He is unable to join us today, but don't worry, you're not going to have to sit here and listen to me during your lunch break. Speak by myself the entire time. We have a terrific guest. We will bring him on in just a couple of minutes. Just to kind of set the background here, we've got the NFL Combine this week. They're already starting to do the interviews, the introductions. Players are being asked about if they believe in Bigfoot and all of those important things that usually go with the NFL draft and the Combine. By the way, Jalen Walker does believe in Bigfoot. He plays with them. He says, we're not going to talk about Jalen much today, though. Today, we're going to talk about another defensive player, and I'm going to go ahead and get straight to it, bring our guest on, and let him kind of tell you why this player is such an intriguing prospect. Joe DeLeone of A to Z Sports. Joe, thank you, man, for coming on today.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on, and I couldn't be more excited to talk about one guy. I feel like every time I do guest appearances, it's always how many names can I rattle off in a 20-minute guest spot. But juiced up for the guy that we're going to be breaking down with the great defensive tackle class.
Yeah. Well, part of that is, I think, your fault, Joe, because you've got so much going on right now that everyone wants to know your opinion on just about everything. So for any viewers or listeners that maybe aren't familiar with you as they should be, can you kind of tell a little bit about where they can find your work, what you do? Because, I mean, man, you're involved in multiple things. You wear all these different hats and you only got the one head. So tell everybody about what you do, man.
Yeah, for the draft cycle, just started taking over the A to Z Sports Film Room channel with my co-host Ryan Roberts, and we're doing quick hit analysis videos, either for scouting reports or reactions to headlines that are happening. A lot of that stuff is going to be coming from the NFL Combine with any crazy headlines that come out. Like today, we just discussed the Titans just really sharing a lot of love for Shedeur Sanders, and we speculated, does it mean that they like Shedeur Sanders enough to sit and take him at number one? Do they trade out? That is the A to Z Sports Film Room channel on YouTube. And then I co-host plenty of college football stuff as well. Rufino and Joe show in the Hack City Pod to catch all the in-season content on CFB.
Yeah, and those are fun shows. I enjoy the Hack City Pod, man. I got to be a little bit honest
Appreciate
here. That's my speed, man. And you played college ball at Rhode Island.
Yes.
I'm a Panthers fan. I host a Panthers show or co-host a Panthers show as well. So we got a lot of love for our long snappers here. JJ Jansen is like the legend that never dies here in Carolina, and that's what you did at Rhode Island. So I'm curious, man, let's get into a little bit with this prospect that we're going to talk about today, because I'm going to tie that back in. I wasn't just saying random things. Does the fact that Darius Alexander, who is your draft crush, I've just spilled all the beans, does the fact that he played at a small school, was that a natural draw to you a little bit, because you're like, man, it doesn't matter competition level, look at the guy's tape?
Well, I think there's a lot that goes into this. One, I always get really annoyed when you hear people going, he's one of my guys, he's one of my biggest crushes, and it's like Abdul Carter, it's like one of the best players in the class, or Travis Hunter, or Mason Graham. Let's be a little creative here. Let's try to go with somebody that's not in the line of vision of all the big names that we think could pan out to be not only good starters, but great, tremendous starters. And my love for Darius Alexander, he wasn't even on my radar before the Senior Bowl. I'm not afraid to admit that. I was not locked in enough to know who Darius Alexander was outside of the crazy pick six that he had in his bowl game against Pitt. Yeah. But his drive and his growth and his boost during this process, it started with the way that he was tearing things up in the one-on-one drills at the Senior Bowl. And he was literally the first guy, as soon as the Senior Bowl ended, and the reason why we have these events, that I said, all right, let's flip on the tape. Let's see what this guy is like. Was he as dominant against MAC opponents in the rest of his schedule as he was at the Senior Bowl? And he absolutely was that dominant. Now, he's not a perfectly rounded prospect, which I'm sure that we're going to get into, but there are some really underrated things that we get from a guy who I think has been flying under the radar until just as recently a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, that's a great point about what these all-star game, right, what these postseason events kind of bring to the table. And the Combine is kind of that as well. You're not necessarily forming opinions based off of these things, but they're highlighting a player that you want to go back and create that opinion with, or they can bolster an opinion with some of the things that they do, whether it's the measurables or the testing. So Darius Alexander in particular, right? This is what I found interesting about him, Joe, and I'd love to hear your opinion on it. 6-year guy, right? He redshirted in 2019. We could take a look at his production here. Redshirted in 2019, been at Toledo the entire time. Now, he didn't start until 2023. So I think some people, when they question it, right, when they start talking about, how dominant can he be in the NFL when he played at this lower level of competition, is he didn't beat anybody out to start until his 5th and 6th year, right? Does that give you any pause? Or are you like, look, man, there was all kinds of extenuating circumstances to what took him that route?
Well, I think what always gets discussed when we have these small school guys, like the first guy that immediately pops in my head is Jeremy Chin that fits this. A lot of times these guys that go on to be truly dominant at the G5 level, the FCS level, or maybe they transfer up after they were playing at a small school, it's because they were late bloomers. Now, I don't have the context fully on Darius Alexander to know, was he one of these guys that was a late bloomer? I brought up Jeremy Chin because I remember speaking to him during that draft cycle, and he had pointed out to me he was tiny and then shot up when he was at Southern Illinois to eventually becoming 6'3" and just this enormous safety prospect. Darius Alexander, again, I'm not totally sure if he was one of those players, but that's always like my first immediate reaction to when a guy has been around for a long time at a smaller school, and then suddenly his final year is when he really explodes and bursts onto the scene. And he had 2 final years of great production that I think is enough context to know, hey, this is an older prospect that's been around that has the tools and the capability to be successful in the NFL because he's had a lot of time to already develop.
All right, you brought it up, so I got to ask you then, how much does the age thing matter? Are you an ageist when it comes to these prospects, or are you just kind of like, look, dude, if the guy can ball, the guy can ball?
I lean towards if the guy can ball, he can ball, but we start to enter into a stratosphere of concern if a guy's like 25 or older. I'm not a big Tyler Shuck fan for part of that reason for a quarterback, but for a defensive tackle, when there's just overall limited shelf life for how long you're able to like really play in the league, I don't mind it. Your window of success, if you're fully developed and ready to play right away, which I think Darius Alexander is, he's ready to contribute early. Mm-hmm. Him being an older player does not mean as much. Now, if he was super raw coming into the NFL and he was all over the place and erratic and had no good technique, and maybe he was underweight or something along those lines, then yes, we would be talking about that. But for this circumstance, no, I'm not worried about him being a 60-year guy.
As long as he's not Chris Winkie, is basically what you're saying, then you're okay.
Exactly. Exactly.
I forgot to give you kudos too for pulling on the Panthers' heartstrings there, talking about Jeremy Chin. Man, you've done a good job here of tying all these things together. All right, so Alexander, let's take a look at some of the measurables here for him. 6'3.5", 304 pounds. These are his Senior Bowl measurements, so these are all confirmed. Hands 10.25 inch, arm length 34 inch, wingspan 82.25 inch. So I mean, this guy's got that frame that you look for the potential to be a dominant defensive force along the line, right? He's got the length. You watch his tape, and we're going to watch a few clips a little bit later after we talk about this for a bit. But he's got that power. He's got the overwhelming burst off of that line. Heavy hands. His run defense in 2024, he received a 90.3 grade from PFF. That was 5th out of 904 eligible interior defenders. Pass rush grade of 78. That was 32nd out of 841. The coverage grade is a hilarious one to me because I don't know why they include the coverage, right? Now, obviously, he had the pick 6. Yeah, it's a great number.
It's probably what really drives that, by the way. That has to be
rounds it out, right? Yeah. You would think that the tackling number might be the one that they highlight, but that one wasn't as pretty. So I understand it. But you do see that his numbers, man, like the way he grades out, at least for PFF, right? And I always like to preface that PFF isn't the end all be all, but it's a really nice resource. It's a good tool, I think. Those guys do a lot of hard work to come up with the algorithm that puts all this in place. But he's graded out nicely, man, for the duration of time that he's played significant snaps. And his snaps that he played in the past 2 years, you brought it up, his past 2 productive seasons, the guy's playing over 600 snaps. That's more than the Mason Grahams. That's more than, a lot of these interior guys that are playing at SEC schools or these Big 12 schools. So he's a reliable guy. He's healthy. When he's on the field, he can be counted on to be there. What was it about Darius Alexander that stood out to you? Because I've got him at interior defensive lineman number 5 on my grades. And that's right around that like TJ Sanders, right around like the Alfred Collins. And Alfred's a different kind of prototype. But for like a TJ Sanders, a Derek Harmon, guys that can get after the quarterback from that interior alignment, what stood out with Darius and how did he win that makes you feel more confident, if you will, about his ability at the next level?
Yeah, you just brought up his physical profile that you had up on the screen a second ago, that he's got the requisite arm length that I'm looking for, 34-inch arms, like that's tremendous length. Being almost 6'4", he is a really similar build and frame. And I think my comparison for him is Chris Jones. Like, I think if he hits, he could be Chris Jones. That's how he wins a lot of his reps. He's taller and he's longer than most interior offensive linemen to be able to keep up with him. This isn't a guy that's just going to try and drive through your chest and overpower you. He effectively knows how to use his length. And we saw that during the Senior Bowl. We saw a guy that was effectively and impactfully using his arms and his hands aggressively to clear blockers. And the other part, coupled with the size, when you're as big as Darius Alexander is, and you have the flexibility that he plays with, this is something that was like super underrated for me. He plays with really good hip mobility, needs to improve his pad level. That's kind of like the shocking negative when you have a guy with good flexibility, because sometimes he plays too high because he's just on the taller side. But he knows how to use that flexibility and length in order to create victories for himself in these pass rush situations. So I see a player that can be a 10 sack guy, around like 7 to 10 sack guy in the NFL, if that pass rush production translates, which is tremendous for an interior rusher.
Yeah, that's a great point, man, about, when you talk about a guy who plays high with the pad leverage, is that something in your mind that is a very coachable thing? Like, naturally, when you're a little bit taller or higher cut, right, it's going to be something that you deal with. But him having that dip, him having that ability to, and it shows up on his film, man, he gets underneath those blockers, right? Mm-hmm. He gets underneath their arms and kind of like dislodges their hands. Is that something, though, that from a technique standpoint, you feel comfortable saying that can be alleviated a little bit at the next level?
I think so. And when we have this discussion on pad level, I mean, like it can get really nuanced, because it just depends on like what their profile is like, and if the way that they play or some of the traits that they have mitigate that. Like if you see on film, and this is the case for Darius Alexander, if you see on film, hey, he still looks flexible, his hips are still moving really well, he's able to bend. If he's in a situation where he needs to create space for himself, he's able to bend and get angular if he needs to while he's rushing. That to me makes me feel better about that. If he was on the shorter side and you're playing high, then I'm starting to get concerned. But knowing that he's almost 6'4" and that he's having those issues, to what you just brought up, because he's high cut, I think that's impacting it. This is no dig at his college coaching staff, but I would think that if in the NFL, if he has this issue, it's something that can be super heavily focused on and improved on, because he has that already just general good flexibility to eventually get lower. There's good reps on tape. It's just there's time to time where he'll be way too high, and that leads to him losing reps, because we all know that the low man wins in football.
Right. I paused this clip here because you were talking about the Senior Bowl, so I went ahead and did run a little bit of his one-on-one reps from the Senior Bowl. This clip right here was one of my favorites. So I believe that's Jonah Mannheim, USC. Yes. Yeah. And he's a good ball player, good looking prospect. There's some people that feel very good about him at the next level, specifically at the center position. I love what Darius is able to do with that long arm, man. That strength that he has of just being able to get one hand on that blocker and he can just move past him. And he holds him off that entire time like that.
Well, more importantly, too, that we saw in that rep, he's using his arm length. And then he's not just standing straight up and rushing like fully vertically. He's using his long ass arm that Jonah Mannheim, who does, I mean, like you can even physically see the difference in arm length between these two guys. He's got nothing he can do. He's just grabbing onto his jersey because he's lost the rep. If you're able to use that long arm, you're talking about, to completely reach and to press off the way that he is. And then also, he doesn't get crazy bending on this play, but to rush on a little bit of an angle creates even more separation. that's where I see his tremendous potential, that there's plenty of centers in the league that don't have really long arms, that if you get him into a one-on-one situation or a guard in a one-on-one situation, that he would go in and win those reps and either turn it into pressures or turn it into sacks.
Yeah. What you said about taking that angle here, right? That's important, I think, because you're talking about him being able to hold off. And it was a great point to say, look physically at the fact that he's got his arm or his hand on the blocker's chest, and the blocker can't barely touch his shoulder pad, right? That arm length is a significant difference. But then he does his footwork here that matches that ability of being able to get past him and then take that little bit of that angle towards the quarterback. You see him outside here, and then he could come back in. Just that little bit of a difference, man. It does make a significant impact on his ability to win. You talk about the bend. Here he is from a wider alignment, right? So how does he win on this one-on-one rep at the Senior Bowl? Tell me what you see after we played this.
Yeah, and I remember this rep too, that like there's a lot of different ways that we can talk about him using his flexibility and his length to win in those situations. Is that he doesn't win initially, and he's able to recover, and he's able to. Flexibility is such a really complex conversation that I don't think enough people do correctly, because it can be used in so many different ways. Guys that are much stiffer have a lot of trouble recontorting and readjusting and countering. So he loses initially here with Connerly, but he knows how to use his body control in order to replace himself in order to finish off the rep and at least get a hand on the quarterback. I don't know if the ball would have been out at this point, but to have that ability to completely flip yourself in a situation where a tackle should have an advantage over an interior defensive lineman, for him to finish the way that he does is incredibly promising. So that ability to recover is also something that goes a very long way when we're having this conversation of his length and his flexibility being a driving force for his potential success.
Changing his angles of attack there with having to do all those different counters, but still having that drive too on that in the lower body to be able to push back right here to finish that play. And Connerly, man, that's a legitimate big time prospect. That's a lot of guys have him ranked as like their number one offensive tackle.
Yeah, and a lot of guys, I mean, this angle that you're showing right here, I mean, most defensive linemen, and if you could play it a little bit further, most defensive linemen would get planted in this situation. Most guys would get completely knocked off their base, but he's able to reestablish his footing. That was a lot of what I saw at the Senior Bowl, and a lot of times it showed up on film.
Yeah. I mean, that's just a really good work. And it's got to encourage NFL coaches. And then again, here he is lining up right over the center. That's something that I liked about him, and I'm curious about your opinion of this, because this is your draft crush and your time to shine here with Darius Alexander. You see it here, the different alignments, man. I mean, I saw there's game reps where he's a stand-up wide 9 rusher, and that was crazy. That's terrifying. First of all, if you're an offensive tackle and you've got this 6 foot, almost 305 pound, incredibly long arm, powerful dude standing up outside of your shoulder, and he's ready to rush the passer, right? Like, we'll get into a couple of these clips and just let it play while you talk about it. But his alignment versatility, is that something that you're higher on because of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Having guys that can rush in different sub packages in different situations, whether it's 1st down and 10 or if it's 3rd and 5, 3rd and 15, whatever it is, having that ability to utilize a defensive lineman across the board, I think that's what's the most exciting. Another additional exciting part about this that is all tied to him having the length. He's not just purely a stumpy rusher that's going to be stuck in run down situations that has to play as a 1 tech or a 0 tech. I think that you could align him across the board, and he could also potentially play multiple schemes, because we have this on film, and we also saw it at the Senior Bowl that he was rushing from a wide alignment. He was rushing as a 1 tech over the center or as a 3 tech over a guard. Having prospects that can do multiple things is what keeps them on the field more, which makes them ultimately far more valuable. I think that this defensive tackle class is awesome, but why I like him the most out of some of these other players is that we have a blueprint for how he could eventually get utilized and deployed by creative defensive minds. Again, just like how Chris Jones has been creatively deployed by Steve Spagnuolo of the Chiefs.
It's a lofty comp, man. I like it, because I think that if you're going to make a comp on somebody, look, if you believe in them, right? Why would the comp be a mid-level player just because that's the school that other person came from, or because that's what they, are same weight, same style, whatever it may be? do what you think the player can impact at the next level. And the Chris Jones one, I see it. It makes sense, man. It's not a comp that I've come up with for him, but I get it a lot, man. You talk about scheme, where he fits best. So let's talk about that a bit, because this play in particular looks to show a little bit of his versatility to be able to play in like a 2-gap scheme as well. Where do you think he fits best? Is there a specific scheme that you think he can find the most immediate success? Or do you think that it truly is look, this guy, you could plant him in just about anything and he's going to be able to offer you something?
Yeah, I'd primarily love for him to play as a 3-tech and a 4-3 scheme, because he's got the quickness, he's got the hands to be a great gap penetrator, great pass rusher in those situations. But I think for how tall and as long as he is, I think he could be a 3-4 defensive end. Like, I think that he could play that role well in the interior in a 3-4 scheme, because he has that size to win. But the best way, though, I think for him to eventually be deployed would be in a 4-3 that allows for him to be a pass rusher, to get in a lot of one-on-one situations as a 3-tech, and to wreak havoc that way.
So is there a team that you have in mind? So look, you've done mock drafts, right? You've been a part of all that kind of stuff. You build out the big boards. Is there a team or a couple of teams that you have in mind, specifically looking at where they're selecting as well in the draft, right? That you would look and say, this is a really good fit. I would love to see him play on this defense.
Well, the easy one to immediately think of is obviously the Kansas City Chiefs, but they're kind of already figured out in how their defense is built, and they already have Chris Jones, so they don't need to get their own secondary Chris Jones, which would be crazy though if they ended up doing that.
It would.
To be able to deploy both. Admittedly, off the top of my head, I can't think of like the greatest, best destination, but I do. There's just so many teams this year that need defensive tackles, and I think that for any team that needs a guy that provides value as more of as a pass rusher and somebody that is going to be successful on third down, that's where he's going to be best deployed. I would be really disappointed if Darius Alexander ends up getting stuck on a team that's got like a loaded defensive line room and that he's just going to be more rotational. That would be really disappointing for me. Somebody that has a need is at a 3-tech, I think would be the best for him.
The athleticism for this dude to be able to make that interception and take it to the house. Oh my God. That was crazy. I mean, the guy
so underrated.
It's wild, isn't it? I watched that clip over and over, just him elevating and catching it and then having the balance there to avoid that tackle.
It paints the picture the most perfectly, this play in particular, the pick six that he has, because he quite literally has one of the most athletic defensive lineman plays that he could have had out of any player. Like, I know that there's so many guys that have done some crazy things, but I haven't seen anyone return a pick six like Darius Alexander has.
It's crazy. And it shows a great play recognition and ability to like read the quarterback's eyes, know where to be in space, and kind of have that innate feel on what he's supposed to be doing there. You're asking this dude to drop back off the defensive line and he makes that play. It is just wild. And that's against Pittsburgh, right? So again, when you get into the Senior Bowl or when you start talking about combine and stuff, you're looking for what can they do against that higher level of competition and those players. It's nice to see him have those big moments in a game like that bowl game against Pitt, and not just in some of these lower level of competition. But honestly, man, the Rams have kind of shown this too. Age, level of competition, anything like that doesn't matter as much. I love what you brought up earlier about the kind of shelf life anyways for these trench players that are going to take a ton of abuse to the body, and that you're not necessarily counting on having these guys for 12 years at an elite level. You're looking at what kind of impact can I get? How long can it sustain? If you got a 24-year-old that comes in and he gives you 5-6 years of great production or great impact, not even production, I don't care so much about the stats, right? Give me the impact on the field. If he does that and you get 6 years, isn't that worth it? Like, how much more are you looking for?
Yeah, and that's like the big thing when you're looking for defensive tackles. And the big emphasis that I always have that I think Darius Alexander exemplifies, how much disruption do they put on film? I'm not worried about the age. I'm more focused on like what do they do on a snap-to-snap basis. I also don't even like really focus on sack production, tackle for loss production. If you are a menace on every single snap that I put on the tape, and you have opposing offensive linemen clearly stressed about trying to deal with you, That's what I want. I think that there's a lot of times that we'll see prospects that media folks and maybe even NFL teams get super caught up on because they're height, weight, speed freaks. Like they're just going to test really well. They have a couple really good flash plays, but the rest of their film is just littered with a bunch of plays where they're not doing anything, where they're just kind of not going through the motions, but they're firing off the ball and there's no result. They're not driving anyone off the ball. They're not requiring a double team. They're not splitting a double team. They're not holding the line of scrimmage. They're not grabbing a running back or a quarterback or just doing something to disrupt the play. If you are doing that more often than not, that to me is the ultimate value. And that's why I am so high on a guy like Darius Alexander compared to somebody like Walter Nolan. Walter Nolan doesn't have the snap-by-snap disruption. He takes a lot of plays off. I feel like Darius Alexander is almost the opposite here with where we have the tangible film to show what he could be.
That's a hot one right there to kind of close it out, isn't it? Walter Nolan, one of the darlings right there. And it's just like, hey, he takes plays off. I like it, man.
I mean, it's on. I don't really get that. People keep asking me this. I put on my big board and everyone's like, where was Walter Nolan? I don't understand. Yes, Walter Nolan has some crazy plays, but there's a lot of tape out there of him going through the motions. Like if there's one guy I was to point out that like doesn't do enough for me on film, it is Walter Nolan. He's just not as consistently aggressive and attacking as he possibly could be. He could be. He keeps calling himself the next Aaron Donald. He's not comparably physically, but he could be that explosive if he played at full speed on every single snap. So, to reiterate, I would much rather have Darius Alexander.
Wow. All right, so let's get out of here. It's the combine. So you brought up like the testing and not always being the best. This is a vague kind of question for you. What are you thinking we're going to see from Darius in some of these athletic testing things? First of all, I love that he is taking part in them. I don't knock players or prospects for not wanting to take part in some of this postseason stuff. The collegiate season is so damn long anymore that like these guys are literally just finishing playing 3 weeks before the combine, right? Like it's ridiculous. What are you expecting out of Darius? Is the 40 time going to be something that everyone's like, wow, how could a guy that big move? He's got the longer arms, so the bench press. Like, is there anything that you're looking at, the specific test that you expect him to really excel at?
Yeah, I don't think he's going to break any records, first and foremost, but I think that he's probably going to be in the upper category of 40-yard dash times because he's kind of on the leaner side. He's not like one of these big hulking masses like Kenneth Grant, for example, who probably will run a really good 40. And I think that his short agility stuff is going to be really good too because he's shown some really quick feet. I would hope that he tests there because that's where he's going to make a lot of money if he tests well in those categories of doing the 3-cone and the short shuttle really, really well. He's just a very light, easy mover. So those are the types of situations that I think he's going to shine.
Appreciate it, man. Real quick, last final thing. You're a Notre Dame guy, correct?
Yes, I am.
So Xavier Watts, where do you got him in your safety rankings? Is this one of your guys too?
I have not done as much homework on the safeties as I would have liked so far, but right now he is safety 4 for me. And it's just not a big safety class. I wouldn't be surprised if I don't see more guys end up getting ranked ahead of him. I'd love to see what his testing is like this week because that's kind of just like the one, not concern, but general question. His instincts when the ball's in the air, it's phenomenal. He's a former receiver, and he attacks the football like he's a former receiver.
Absolutely. Joe, man, thank you so much, dude. You've given me half hour of your time, and you have got so much going on. For everyone that didn't see at the beginning of this, let everyone know where they can find your work, what you've got on the horizon here. And I know you're trying to get out of here on a time limit, but tell a little bit about how you got to this point as well, right? I think that it's a really cool thing, man, to start the journey at a individual creative point, independent point, and then you start working for outlets and things like that. And that's something that you've done. So I'm a fan of that for you. If you have any advice or anything like that for the people that are trying to do it, this is a new show that we've just begun. So anything you have to say, man.
Yeah, I had the advantage for the first 3 years out of college for me, working as a producer. So like having the ability to see the back end. And there's a lot of people that I know that are hosts that don't really know what's required on the back end, don't know how to create a compelling story by knowing what's trending and just to really engage an audience. They just They lean on the fact that they know how to talk really well. And sometimes that doesn't get you very far. So I had the advantage of working at multiple locations, the Believe Network as a producer, at Yahoo Sports as a producer, and interning at NFL Network and Sirius XM for a period of time before I was really given opportunities to work for outlets. And the biggest thing for me, the way I got here, is just being consistent, constantly putting out content. If it's on Twitter, if it's through the podcasts that I do, just going above and beyond. At the end of the day, the only way that you get there is by doing more than everybody else. And sometimes it's just doing more, showing up every single day. And I'm just thankful I get to represent A to Z Sports right now. And I get to do all the draft content that we've been ripping out. And I'm very excited for how this draft cycle is going to finish up.
Killer stuff, man. You've been crushing it. Keep doing it. Appreciate the time. We are going to go ahead and we will wrap this up for today. We'll keep an eye on Darius Alexander at the Combine, and we'll see what he does April 24th, maybe, because I'm envisioning maybe a first-round pick that surprises everybody. But we'll find out how that goes. So for Draft Crush, I'm your host, Ricky Rains, and we will see you next time.